Hey there everyone, Indro here, and today I'll show you how I created this Halloween themed Photoshop composition. Well, this was my entry for the Spooky Edit War contest hosted by one of my favorite YouTuber Benny from Benny Productions. So this composition took about 12 hours for me to complete it entirely. So in this video I'll be kind of breaking down and covering the highlights so that you can get the idea of what I did and what are the important steps that I went through. But before that, I'll quickly go over the rules that was set by Benny and we participants had to follow. Firstly, we had to use all the stock images that Benny provided. It may be as small as it can be, but we had to include each and every stock image into our composition. Secondly, we cannot use any additional textures or overlays other than what Benny provided. If we wanted to use something, we can hand paint them into our composition. And our artwork can be of any size and resolution, and it must not have any text or watermarks on top of it. Alright, so with these in mind, let's get started. So firstly, as we are not allowed to use any additional textures or overlays, I also refrained from using any additional brushes. So what I did was I created two Photoshop brush out of the stock images that Benny provided. Like you can see here, I used the grass stock image to create a grass brush and I used the sky stock image to create a cloud brush. Then onto our composition, I placed the landscape and duplicated it a couple of times and used the clone stamp tool to get rid of the imperfections, create the grass or some areas that I wanted, and also use the same clone stamp tool to create the road that will be coming from the mansion on the top right in front of us. I also got rid of the sky because we'll be placing the sky stock image at the very back. Next, it's time to place the trees. We'll be having two big trees on both sides of our composition. I'm just placing it and aligning to see what best suits for us according to our composition. I'm just masking out some of the branches because the mansion will be there and I don't want to obstruct the view. Next, I put the mansion, just skewed it a bit so that it has an angular look. And then again I use the clone stamp tool to create the road. Next I took the grass stock image, placed it onto my canvas and used the clone stamp tool to create the grass exactly where I wanted. Next I used the grass brush that I created at the very beginning and used it to add more details by masking out different areas and also painting on the layer mask to create that fine grass blades. Then I kept following the same technique to add the grass on the bottom of the two trees and also in our foreground. Next I placed the sky, transformed and aligned it accordingly. Then I placed some of the rocks that were provided in the stock image and tried to create a rough overall idea of how the final composition will look like. I added the moon, I masked it out, I added the two ruins and I will mask them out and shape them like the arches of the gate. I'm painting manually and getting rid of all unwanted areas and trying to create an impression that these are broken arches of a very old gate. Then I wanted to add some very old broken and bent bars for our gate, so I went ahead and painted them manually. I really loved the tree from the stock images that was having some ivies on it, so I used that tree, I copied the ivies and placed them onto our two other trees. Next it's time to place the tombstones. I added the cemetery stock image, masked out everything except the tombstones and tried to place it and feather out the grass areas so that it looks realistic. I tried to add some variations to the pumpkin, so I used the warp tool to change the eyes. I'm adding some more pumpkins from the pumpkin stock image. I masked out the pumpkins from the white background, created separate copies and I'll be duplicating and placing them, rotating, scaling and skewing and placing them here and there in our composition. Next, I'm adding some more grass from the grass stock image to add some more realism, maybe some grass below the stone arches and some over here just below the pumpkins. I'm again taking those ivies from the third tree stock and placing them onto our main trees. Then I wanted to add some pine forest at the background and add some atmospheric depth with fog and mist. So the pine forest was not provided in the stock image, but I really had it in my mind, so I started painting manually. First, I created 5 or 6 pine trees and then duplicated them, transformed and scaled and modified them a little bit and used them to create my pine forest. I'm adding some lighter shades of green for the distant pine trees so that I can recreate the atmospheric depth. I used the same pine trees on the right hand side, scaled them down a bit, made multiple copies and created a distant pine forest. Again, the same principle goes here. The farther the trees are, the fainter they will have, so I washed away the color, and the nearer they are, they will look more darker. Then I tried to create some broken up parts of the mansion, so I again created a layer mask and painted manually to show that some areas are broken and create an impression that the mansion is pretty old. I'm adding another tree on the right hand side just behind our main tree so that we can have a little more variation in our composition. The branches are obstructing the view of the mansion, so I'm just removing them by painting on the layer mask with black. I'm again off to modifying the pumpkin. I wanted to have a bigger smile on the pumpkin, so I used the transform tool and the warp function over there to distort and change it, and then I painted manually with black to create the hollow cavity. Next, we'll proceed on to the color grading part. I added some blue color grading on the sky and I used the cloud brush that I created at the very beginning and started adding some clouds and some drama onto the sky. I also changed the blending mode of the moon to screen and painted with white on top of it on a new layer where I changed the blending mode to linear dodge so that we can have this nice subtle glow effect. I also added some layers with blending mode set as soft light and painted on them to add some nice subtle glow on the sky. Then I started to work my way from the back to the front of the layers and I started applying the nighttime filter on the most far away object, and I gradually progressed and added the filters onto the objects that are in front of us. So the filter that I used over here, you can find it in one of my video tutorials where I show you how you can change a day image into night by adding one photo filter with a blue color grading and a hue saturation layer where you take down the hue saturation, and you can also add an exposure to turn everything a bit dark. You can obviously check that video, the link should be in the description section. Next, with making everything look like a nighttime scene, I also started adding the highlights. I kept the moon as the source of the light and I tried to gauge how the light source will be, how the angle of the shadow will be. I created simple hue saturation layer. I checked the colorize tick mark. I shifted the hue layer to something around the shades of blue. I brought up the lights and then I painted on the layer mask with white to show the highlights. I also played with the blend if a bit so that the highlights can only restrict to the whiter regions. I also started adding shadows with an exposure layer. Next, I'm adding some mist, as you can see, and I'm trying to create an atmospheric depth. I'm using the same cloud brush that I created from the sky stock image and added the mist with a soft whitish blue color. I'm keeping the pine trees farthest from us with a lighter shade than the pine trees that are nearer to us. So this will create a natural depth, or that we call as atmospheric depth. It happens like in the air, you always have particles floating around. It can be dust particles, it can be fog, it can be mist, and it obstructs our view. So anything that is at a distance, we cannot see it clearly and it seems like it's hazy. So that's why it should have a lighter color than what is nearer to us. I'm using the same principle for 3 stacks of pine forest layer on the right hand side. I'm creating layers in between the pine tree layers and painting with the cloud brush with whitish blue color to create the fog and the mist. Then I'm also manually painting the highlights. I'm again keeping in mind the source of the light, which is the moonlight. I'm gauging the angle and adding the highlights and also the shadows accordingly. I'm using the same 3 layers, 1 photo filter, 1 hue saturation and 1 exposure to turn everything into a nighttime scene. This time I'm simply taking a solid color fill and adding the highlights. I've again gone into the blending options and tweaked with the blend if section so that the highlights only sticks to the white areas and it looks more natural and realistic. I have again added here the shadows with an exposure layer. Next, time to add the nighttime filter onto our gate. Once done, I'm painting the highlights manually. Here I have simply added a hue saturation layer with the colorize checkbox checked and some hues in the shades of blue and painting on the layer mask with white. I'm adding some shadows on the ruins of the gates with an exposure layer. Then I'm painting the shadows of the gate that will fall on the ground. I'm using an exposure layer, but I'm paying a great deal of attention to the angle of the shadows based on the moonlight. Now it's time to apply the color grading onto our tombstones. And I'm painting the highlights manually. I'm adding some more grass and reeds to add some more variations. I've applied the nighttime color grading on our left hand side tree and I'm again playing with the blend if section of the highlights layer so that the highlights sticks only to the lighter areas, and once we paint on the layer mask with white, the highlights that we'll get will have a more realistic look. Now time to add the color grading on the trees on our right side. Now it's time to make everything change that's in front of us with the nighttime color grading. With that done, I'm off to add the highlights. I'm using the same technique, a hue saturation layer with colorize checkbox checked, the hue slider in the shades of blue, the lightness is cranked up, painting on the layer mask with white. I'm adding shadows over here, and again I'm paying a great deal of attention to the source of light, which is the moon, and painting the shadows accordingly. I'm off to transform the right side pumpkin. I'm using the same method. I'm using the free transform warp tool to make the smile bigger. I'm painting with black manually to fine tune the cavity. Now since I'll be making these pumpkins glow, the interior of the pumpkins will be visible, so I duplicated parts of the pumpkin layer, removed the nighttime filter and added in places of these cavities. Now it's time to add the glow. I created a new layer with linear dodge as blending mode and painted with some dark orange color. I kept stacking layers and kept painting until I got the desired effect. Generally keeping the color in the darker shades and the blending mode as linear dodge or hard light, it works best. Next I added some soft glow to make it look like the pumpkin is glowing from the inside and we are able to see the light from the cavities. I'm doing the same for the second pumpkin. I duplicated parts of the pumpkin and filled in the holes so that once we make it glow, it feels like we're seeing the inside of the pumpkin. I added a solid color in the shades of dark orange, changed the blending mode to linear dodge, and painted on the layer mask with white to create the glowing effect. I kept stacking up the layers and painted with soft round brushes to get the desired look. Now it's time to add some glow on the smaller pumpkins with the light coming from the big pumpkin. Here I also had to pay attention because now we are having two light sources, one soft light coming from the moon and a kind of strong light coming from the pumpkin. I added some highlights on the adjacent ground and tried to darken up the grass where the pumpkin hits the ground because there will be shadow and no light. Next, it's time to make the mansion glow from the inside. I marked out the region of the windows, then I marked out region of the broken glass, and I also marked out the planks for the boarded windows. What I tried to do here is that since the light is coming from the inside, I wanted to keep the effect that the broken windows will create, like it will create a translucent hazed out effect. So the light will be stronger where the broken windows are, but where the glass is present will have a kind of washed out a hazed effect, and where the wooden planks are we will have no lights over there because the light is obstructed. So I took a kind of hard approach, but I thought it would look more realistic and nice. Then I added some ambient glow over the windows. And I also painted the highlights manually on different beams and pillars of the mansion. Next, I took a pumpkin, I removed the areas of the eye and the mouth and the nose, and I placed it on one of the windows, and that's actually Jack, so it's kind of an Easter egg, and that's the source of the name of this composition, Jack's Halloween. Actually, there's a little bit of thought behind that because the pumpkin that Benny chose was very similar to Jack Skellington from Tim Burton's classic The Nightmare Before Christmas. So I thought let's add a little bit of Easter egg cause that will be fun. Then I used the same cloud brush to add some ambient glow in front of the windows and make it happen like there is some reflection in the mist that is surrounding the mansion. I also added some ambient glow over the pumpkins to make it look more realistic. I added some tinge of green to add some more drama onto our composition, and also brightened up the blue at the distance with the same cloud brush. Next I added some fireflies. Next is one of the most important part in a Halloween themed artwork, and that is bats. I couldn't help but add the bats, but the bats were not there in our stock images, so I painted them manually. And finally, it's time for some camera raw filter. I boosted up the whites a bit, added some more drama, tried to change different sliders to see what looks best, but more or less it already looked pretty good to me, so I didn't tweak that much, and the final artwork is ready. So if you have watched till now, I really hope you have liked this photo composition. It took me almost 12 hours over a span of 2 days and was kind of really becoming difficult to how I compress and put it into one single video. But I hope you got some idea about how I created this, and if you're liking my videos, please don't forget to subscribe my channel. Do share me your thoughts by leaving a comments down below. I'll see you in my next video, and till then, enjoy creating.